Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on building effective ecosystems for online dispute resolution. My name is David Porteous. I'm the founder of Integral Governance Solutions, and I'm talking to you today from my home in Boston in the US. And I'm joined by two wonderful panelists from different parts of the world who I'll introduce more later, but Maria Luciano joins us from Brazil, and Sachin Malhan joins us from India today. So let me start today's session by briefly framing what we would like to cover. It's very intentional that we're talking about ecosystems for ODR and not simply systems. Certainly we can talk, and we will perhaps cover some specific systems, but among the three of us, our interest really is the ecosystems that bring together the regulators, the consumers, the civil society organizations, as well as the technologists in cracking what have been growing problems in the digital world in different parts of the globe. And we'll talk specifically around some of Brazil's experience and some of India's experience as two countries that really are, I think, pioneering interesting examples of addressing this issue. First, though, just to check, we don't assume that all of you are familiar with online dispute resolution or ODR. So very briefly, it's a concept that really has its roots in the 1990s with the rise of the widespread internet that enabled the type of online interaction that you need for this, but it also required it through the growth of e-commerce, which meant that disputes, small disputes among buyers and sellers, for example, became a major issue which platforms had to resolve if they were to build digital trust. So we understand many of you are involved as supervisors in the financial sector, or at least concerned about consumer protection questions that need to be supervised. So you'd be familiar with grievance redressal as something which is common. It's baked into most financial laws, for example. It's a role that many supervisors play or play through ombudsmen and roles like that. Well, ODR includes grievance redressal, but it goes much broader than that. It's broader because it includes not only arbitrating on disputes, but it could include negotiation, mediation. It certainly thinks about dispute prevention as an important category to consider as well. Another reason why it's more than grievance redressal is because as we see digital systems scaling around the world, they bring a whole host of problems which aren't simply problems of the system. So to give you an example, which we'll build on in this conversation in the area of payment systems, when you have an instant payment system, which is a push payment system, the payer always authorizes a transaction. And so what can go wrong is simply whether that transaction lands in the beneficiary's account, whether it's delayed, it ends up in the wrong account. Those are the kind of grievances narrowly defined that there might be. But it turns out that when you start having instant payment systems at large scale, that's the tip of a much bigger iceberg of problems. And the problems are caused by fraud, all sorts of issues which countries like Brazil, India too, have been grappling with, where the transactions may be authorized, but the usage is unintended because people are being caused to make payments into accounts as part of spams and a part of fraud processes. And so when we talk ODR, we're talking about trying to holistically address some of what is at the root of building trust in large-scale, societal-scale digital systems. So at this stage, let's just have a feel from those of you in the room. We can post the first poll here to get a sense of whether you have had some experience of an ODR system in your country. And let's see if that poll is live. So I see, okay, there's a second poll that's live. There's another one, which, there we are. Have you seen effective dispute resolution in your country? Perhaps those of you online, give us a sense so that we know who we're talking to here as to whether you have seen that. As you answer that, so have you seen effective online dispute resolution mechanisms in your country? Yes, no, or unsure. As you think about that, let me just introduce the second concept which we'd like to speak around today. And that's the concept of digital public infrastructure, or DPI. It's a topic probably familiar to many of you. that's risen in prominence in the last few years since India's G20 presidency. And it refers both to an approach to thinking about digital infrastructure, an approach that's open, that's modular, that's interoperable, that's scalable. It also refers to particular systems, such as payment systems. And in the financial sector, we see some of the most active DPIs globally, especially in payment systems. And we're going to talk about a particular example in just a moment of that. Also refers to open finance, which is scaling now in Brazil and India, as well as other parts of the world, as large-scale DPI systems, which make a big difference in the financial sector. So the DPI thinking brings an approach to ODR, which can be part of building ecosystems which are indeed interoperable and open and can achieve this bigger benefit of promoting digital trust. So I'm not able to see the outcome of the poll here. I don't know if anyone else can yet, but I'm assuming you all have voted, and we'll see if we can get that up later. But let's move to our panelists here who bring two different perspectives, although in common, they both have a legal background. So I'm going to turn first, Maria, to you. So Maria is now a consultant with the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure based in Brazil, but has a history of involvement, including lecturing in data governance through Data Privacy Brazil and other types of civil society and think tank mechanisms in that country. So Maria, as we think about building effective ecosystems for ODR, perhaps you could talk to us a bit about your experience of the PIX payment system in Brazil and the governance around that, and very particularly about how ODR is being used to address some of these next generation problems which are arising in Brazil.
Thank you so much, David. Happy to. Hi, everyone. So I think everyone is familiar with PIX, which is Brazil's instant payment system. And I think PIX is a great example, a great case study for many things around DPI, but I would suggest especially governance. PIX was created, it was co-designed, it was co-created with a working group that the Brazilian Central Bank put together with a lot of people, a lot of actors within the financial ecosystem in Brazil. But interestingly enough, there weren't representatives of civil society organizations, of the people that were going to use the system. Even in terms of language, when the Brazilian Central Bank speaks of PIX ecosystem participants, it's talking about banks and financial institutions. It is not talking about the people and the consumers, which is very representative of that rationale. And then again, after PIX was created, that same working group turned into the PIX Forum, which exists today, which is the permanent advisory board through which all PIX rules and procedures are submitted to consultation, public consultation. But again, it is advisory. So, not everything that is recommended or that is suggested by this group, it's, incorporated into the PIX rules. And also the PIX Forum has a lot of different working groups divided in topics. And there's one specific working group, they call it security working group, which is the one currently discussing are the PIX special refund mechanism, we call it MED. But interestingly enough, that particular working group, the security working group, it is very restricted. So there's a narrative that the PIX Forum is open to everyone. Even some sessions are, live broadcasts on YouTube. But that particular working group, the security working group, is very restricted. Only associations are participants there initially, mostly related to banks and, again, financial institutions. And then this year, we were able to negotiate 3 civil society organizations to join, which is very new. But then again, 5 years into PIX being rolled out and being implemented, so it is late. But then again, currently they are discussing our special refund mechanism because it's been very inefficient. The PIX refund mechanism has been rolled out since the beginning of the PIX, its initial implementation, but 9 out of 10 Brazilians don't know about this mechanism, don't know how to use it. And even when this mechanism is activated by consumers, the amount of cases where the reimburse occurs is only 9%, according to the Central Bank of Brazil. So I think it's a very interesting case of how efficiency is linked to governance. Many of the issues that can explain this inefficient relates to governance. The fact that people don't know about it relates to communication. The fact that there were the current design of the mechanism cannot address some of the schemes that have been going on, some of the fraud, social technical designs that have been going on. Also relate to the fact that the people being impacted by those schemes and those cases are not at the table discussing them. So those are some very interesting limitations. And then again, we have been discussing how to improve the system. Again, a very difficult conversation because, again, civil society is the minority. We are new there. We're trying to bring perspectives, but we also have to fight narratives of, well, we need to implement a new pilot, but we cannot bear financial institutions to higher costs. So when we're going to decide a cutoff value to decide when the system is activated, the mechanism is activated, we're discussing a minimum value. And then to give an example, one of the proposals is 200 reais. So only transactions that are 200 reais or more should activate the special mechanism in case of fraud. But again, 75% of all PIX transactions are under 200 reais. So that would be great for banks and financial institutions because, pilot and operationalizing that would be will have less cost for them. But for the people, 200 reais is a lot if we compare with the Brazilian current minimum wage. So not being able to have that type of resource, it is a concern. And then again, another thing is about public communication of public policy. I think a lot of the great things that came out of PIX was the fact that we have a central bank that has autonomy, and we're able to put all this initiative together. It was able to create like mandatory participation for financial institutions to engage with initiative. They didn't have a choice. But the thing is, a lot of the same argument of autonomy is also used to shield the central bank to be as transparent and as inclusive as we would like. So when we're talking about public policy efficiency, we're also talking about public policy communication. So people not knowing that there's a redress mechanism, not knowing how to use it, not knowing that it's available, it's also a major concern for us. And then again, there's also discussions about, again, these digital systems, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within this power and asymmetrical power dynamics. So we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about literacy, both digital, both data, and in Brazil, that is such a huge and unequal country. So it would be really interesting to see how that plays out and how the central bank can manage and leverage all these different knowledges and different expertise, but in a more constructive, participatory, inclusive way. But I'll pause here, and yeah, I'll be happy to hear say more afterwards. Thank you.
Maria, thank you. So you've given us an excellent lens into a really important use case, because PIX really is regarded as a leading payment system in terms of its volume. It's certainly one of the fastest growing around the world. And yet, as you said, it has these issues which come out, such as dealing with fraud and so on. And that the only way you're arguing to address that is through having an approach where the governance can reflect the broader ecosystem of users and user views and so on. It's not just the narrow system solution that Brazil has the beginnings of, right? This MED mechanism, but it's so much more. And I really hear your point about communication as well, which is that it's one thing to have a system. It's another thing for people to know that there is a system and then to trust that that system, in fact, can work to solve these very small disputes. And maybe just 200 reals, give us an idea in dollars for the sake of the audience. What would that be like as the threshold that's being discussed?
Is it 50? I think $50 around that.
$50. Yeah. Okay. So that gives a sense of the size of the kind of disputes at issue here that might need to be addressed, subject to these trade-offs that are being discussed in the background as to what needs to be covered. Thank you, Maria. So we'll come back. There are a lot of things to dig in there. Let me also remind the audience that you can chat questions and comments to us, and we'll see if we can handle those. What I'd like to do now, though, is introduce Sachin, our second speaker, who also has a background in the law. And what he has done is he has co-founded Agami in India as the example of a social change catalyst organization that works particularly in the justice sector. And as I've come to understand a bit of what Agami does, it's a remarkable breadth of things, Sachin. But perhaps you could talk to the audience about how, through Agami, you are seeking to promote a vision for how ecosystems come to bear on improving justice in India, but specifically online dispute resolution as a way of achieving greater justice.
Thank you, David. Thank you for this opportunity. Hi, everyone. Um, uh, so I think the best way to look at this is that a lot of the changes that need to be made, um, they require a lot of different people to work together to make those changes happen. Take, for example, something as simple as ODR. ODR is not a new idea. You have excellent ODR providers and examples in the world. But suppose you're trying to make ODR happen for, say, loans, say unsecured loans, something that all of you are familiar, personal loans or even vehicle loans, which are practically unsecured because the motor vehicle is no good once it goes out of the garage. But the point is that the moment you want to use ODR for something like this, say an unsecured loan dispute, it's not just about one participant, right? It's not just about the bank that wants to do it. They need to have entrepreneurs and innovators who come up with a new way to do it. They need to have the blessings of the judiciary that is not going to look at these kind of resolutions and say, why aren't you going to the debt recovery tribunal? Why are you trying this new creative thing? It needs the buy-in of the government, which feels that this is a policy, this is an approach worth supporting. It needs lawyers. So essentially, all of these changes, because of the fact that they occur in these very well regulated spaces, need many people to be working together. And this is something that is very prevalent in the justice system. Because I gave you one example of the financial sector with the unsecured loans, but pretty much everywhere, even with e-commerce, which is now more regulated because of the consumer risks, you start to see many people need to be on board. So that is really what we have been doing, which is essentially building an ecosystem of change-minded people that cuts across these different sort of silos, so that when we look at exciting ideas, there are many people who are champions of that. And an example I can take for you is really the growth of ODR in the financial sector. Today, more than 100 banks and non-banking financial institutions use ODR. In fact, every Indian, when they get their mutual fund update, at the bottom it says, if you have a problem, please use our ODR solution. So it has really reached that point. And the reason that's happened, it's a very recent journey, is because one bank, in this case ICICI Bank, about 6 years back, arguably in many ways India's largest bank, took that chance and said, look, you know what, we need to get the supply and demand cycle going. We've got so many disputes that shouldn't be going to the recovery tribunals. So let's move these disputes to a creative platform solution. And they looked for startups and they selected providers that could do that. And their confidence went, and then the resulting success of these providers in using mediation, using arbitration to resolve these disputes, has now resulted in India having the largest finance ODR ecosystem in the world, and over 100 banks and NBFCs. So, but the ecosystem part becomes even more important, because ICICI could not do that alone. It requires the government to say, this sounds like a great idea. It requires the judiciary to say, if it comes in appeal, we're not going to squash this, saying, what is this large scale online resolution of these things? So all those pieces and building trust, familiarity, I think has been absolutely instrumental to making that ecosystem take off. And that really, is the critical part of our work. And it's happened at the same time as the DPI growth in India, the digital public infrastructure. So these ecosystems have grown together, in many cases with shared communities. And naturally, what has happened is people have started asking the question, look, we need a high pace, high frequency resolution system that can match the digitization of commerce, travel, all that. We can't be running to the consumer courts. We can't be running to the debt recovery tribunals. We need something high frequency, high pace. And naturally, that innovation has carried through into DPI, with DPI then wanting to integrate ODR inside itself and offer ODR interoperability with ODR providers on those platforms itself. So you see a very natural organic progression, but really, frankly, it's coming from a robust, interconnected system of actors and leaders and organizations. I'll stop there, but that's the gist of really how we've kind of gotten from one of the slowest financial dispute resolution systems to one of the faster ones today.
Yeah, it feels like, Sachin, that India is really showing in this example and others, but this one we're talking about today, what leapfrogging looks like. Because as you said, the
I
Indian
think that is
court
the right word, David. That is the right word, because if we had to fix those physical systems, I think that would have been too slow. I think the answer is to really say, no, we need a totally different approach and use digital,
The thing that strikes me about the Indian story is not just the scaling of it, which you've referred to, it's also the breadth of it. So as I've come to understand better, the environments in which ODR is now being actively applied isn't only in the context of payments, although it is there, although India's reach is not yet extended to cover some of what Brazil is now getting into, which is where I think there's a very fruitful dialogue across countries which are on this journey. That's maybe part of the international ecosystem that we're discussing here in this conference, I guess, is part of encouraging that. But also in sectors like securities, where I've been struck by how the securities regulator has implemented ODR approach using ODI institutions to help handle disputes around securities, which are widespread as well. So it's a breadth as well as a depth type of thing going on.
Absolutely, David. The India Securities Regulator, which is SEBI, many people might be familiar, Securities Exchange Board of India, has been a complete pioneer. If you look, they have been the ones to catalyze the smart ODR platform. I would encourage everyone to take a look at it. In 1 year alone, it's onboarded 10,000 disputes that the different market participants and intermediaries, the exchanges, right? The Bombay Stock Exchange, the National Stock Exchange, the different exchanges, those disputes that come up. And they've catalyzed this system, which is really allowing multiple providers, ODR providers, to provide their services on that platform. And if you look at the resolution rate, it's off the charts, So out of 6,000 that have gone to ODR, close to 4,500 or so, I may be getting the numbers slightly here or there, have been resolved. So that has demonstrated very clearly what the capability of this is, and in fact provided a template. And the secret really is that the leadership of ICICI Bank, the general counsel, moved and became the executive director of Securities Exchange Board. So you see, this is why I think leaders are so critical, that when you have somebody who believes that we can figure it out, let's try, and then he comes and he rallies all the exchanges to try to incorporate this. So it's beautiful to see, and it really backs up that point. Ultimately, it's change-minded leaders.
I think that point has come through strongly from both of you, which is, as we think about the ecosystems around ODR, it really is so much more than just the systems. There are plenty in India and in Brazil. And in fact, Maria, I want to ask you about another Brazilian one in a moment. But it is about the leaders who help to catalyze change that sticks in the systems. And Maria, to your point, it's around having a voice, a civil society voice that can represent what the experience is of users in these processes, which otherwise become narrowly technical and don't solve necessarily for user trust as a key ingredient. But here's the thing, Maria. So we talked about the breadth and depth of India's amazing ODR ecosystem, really at a scale that is quite astonishing in terms of how quick that is built up. But Brazil too, it's not new to Brazil. We've talked about PIX as an example that is scaled recently, but Brazil has another example of ODR that goes back, that handles a particular part of the chain beyond the financial sector, and that's, I'm talking about consumidor.gov.br. Could you talk a bit about how that fits into the ecosystem of ODR provision in Brazil and what the experience has been with that?
Of course, I think that's a great example. Again, I think 80% of all complaints filed at consumer.gov have usually resolved. But it's also interesting to notice that most of the complaints are against banks and financial institutions, which are the actors thinking about the PIC's redressal mechanisms. So you kind of get a sense in terms of the governance of PICs. But it's interesting to see in terms of looking into through a DPI approach. When we look at consumer.gov, we see a few issues like interoperability or accessibility. To be able to file a complaint at the in the platform consumer.gov, you need to have a gov.br account, which needs to be, there are different levels: gold, silver, and bronze. And you need to have a silver or golden one, which requires biometric data for a citizen to have one. So again, in order to file a complaint, you need to give your data and you need to identify yourself, which when we're talking about redressal mechanism, especially against government official, it is a concern, right? Not being able to identify those people and maybe suffer something afterwards. So it is concerning in terms of in terms of approach and accessibility, but it's also interesting to see how that type of information, again, talking about data governance, how the information within the platform is managed. We can have information about businesses, what kind of businesses do we want to engage with based on those complaints being filed at consumer.org. So it is interesting to see how the DPI approach can be so important and effective and generate change in all these different aspects, but also it needs some safeguards and risk mitigation measures. And again, it goes back to accessibility and communication. People don't know about PIC's redressal mechanism. People know about consumer.gov, which is interesting to see, and how they engage with it. I think that there's this narrative of people, only people who are educated have something to say and file complaints. That's not the case. We do have research both in India, and I saw a research from the French Data Protection Office stating that most complaints filed enforcing people's data subjects' rights come from men, well-educated men, middle-aged men, white men. So it's really interesting to see that there are complaints to be made, but not everyone feels empowered to make them. And then again, those digital systems that we're talking about, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within those scenarios and power relations. So it's really interesting to see how they all relate. Yeah.
Well, you brought us back squarely to this question of how the DPI approach helps to scale solid and effective ODR systems. So I love your connection there, which is to say, if you want to have a dispute, might be a grievance, it might be a broader dispute, but if you need to have it resolved, you need to know the identity of the parties involved, and you need to be able to share the information, the document trail, in a form that is verifiable, that is authentic. That's what courts obviously are obsessed about. And this is where it seems to me the real potential is to think of ODR systems not as they have been in the past, islanded on the side, existing in silos or around particular platforms that have built very big and effective systems. And let's be frank, the biggest ODR systems today remain those operated by e-commerce platforms in terms of their scale and functionality. And they do a great job, but it's a limited job. It's only the transactions on that platform. And so as you both are engaged in complex societies with so many other areas that are not covered at all, it feels like ending this islanding of ODR systems by connecting them with these other systems is an essential part of the way ahead if there is to be effective arbitration. Sachin, India, what are you seeing of those connections happen? You've already touched on it, but can you talk some more for the benefit of the audience here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one reality is that the effect of digital public infrastructure when you're applying it to power any field, say e-commerce or healthcare or in whichever area, the effect is to make things much faster, right? And make things much more efficient. And I think that automatically means the stewards of those systems, whoever is the community involved, they recognize very quickly that the current grievance mechanisms and dispute resolution mechanisms won't work. You need to have an equally fast dispute resolution or grievance mechanism. Otherwise, there's a big disconnect. The person who is getting, the example we take is And this is, of course, at the consumer level, the person who's getting his pizza delivered in 15 minutes is not going to wait 1 year to resolve their issue with, so it just won't work, right? So the pace has to be, we have to think in terms of, okay, it has to be at that pace. And if it has to be at that pace, I'm not saying it has to be 15 minutes, but, fast. If it has to be at that pace, then we have to bring ODR onto that. And then what we need is ODR solutions that innovate as fast as the solutions themselves. Like, if you think about it, like, the whole point of DPI is people are constantly, like, payments. I think the difference in India has is that, and there's good and bad, is that you can have many people developing payment solutions, right? Of course, there's a limit imposed by the payments, the company that anchors the payment infrastructure, but you have many payment providers, right? Google Pay and Paytm and Phone Pay. You have many. So you've allowed people to build these, and each have some benefit, some unique aspect about themselves. That's how they say it. But as you see innovation on the come onto the infrastructure, payments, or say healthcare DPIs or education DPIs, whatever it is, you have to see ODR keep up with that pace and innovate. So you have to see, we'll need to mediate this in this way. Oh, we'll need to arbitrate this like this. We will need to protect assets like that. So you'll need to see that commensurate innovation. So one is, you need to recognize you can't have some system sitting somewhere. It has to be innovators and entrepreneurs who are innovating as fast. So you have to enable them. So not just do you have to connect with them, you have to make sure that all the modules of the infrastructure are also supporting them to validate the identity of participants, to get the financial data quickly, to be able to make a payment or settle a score or repay an amount quickly. So you need to empower that. So this is what we are noticing. We're noticing that not just is DPI seeing the need for ODR, it is empowering ODR. And as a result of it, it is scaling ODR. So it's that whole cycle that is happening. And really, it's entrepreneurs, right? It's DPI recognizing that DPI is an entrepreneur empowerment game, whether it's the entrepreneur supplying the pizza or resolving the dispute.
It's such an interesting perspective, DPI as an entrepreneur empowerment game. And yet that is the effect that one takes away from seeing India closer up in this space, and thinking about ODR as also, in some sense, entrepreneur empowerment, right? In the absence of, as you said, quick and fair and efficient dispute resolution, there's no way that small entrepreneurs can think about thriving across digital platforms. They may be able to function on one, but no way across them, and then their livelihoods remain
Absolutely.
dependent.
If a restaurant comes onto a system, and that restaurant's capacity to wait for a certain chunk of money to be returned to it is much less than a very established restaurant that is already using digital mechanisms. The whole point of DPI is smaller players are able to come, but that means smaller players are at higher risk if the system is not returning them properly. So therefore, both things go hand in hand.
Totally. I see in our chat a question from Shokat, which he's asking about essentially how to address, in the context of payment schemes, the fact that they take a long time around their chargeback mechanisms, how to make the life of the consumer easier. Shokat, I'm not sure what a TAT is, I have to say. We're throwing around acronyms as well, ODR, DPI.
Probably turnaround time, Shokat.
Turnaround time. All right, got it. So, Maria, any ideas in answer to Shokat from what has already been the case in... thank you, Shokat. Yes. All right. I've learned my acronym for today. So this is semantic interoperability that's happening here. It's being enhanced. Maria, from Pix experience, what would you say to Shokat about what learning there might be for improving turnaround time?
Thank you so much for your question. I think that, when you're talking about, especially again, transactions that involve an amount that can be so important to people, I think that's definitely an important conversation to have. I think in Brazil we have longer periods of getting an answer back from the banks when we file a complaint and request a refund, and then again, when those answers come, they don't usually have much justification, which is also concerning in terms of governance, in terms of the rules being applied to the system. And I think one interesting thing that is currently a new research just show is that when we're talking about PICs, there's also this information asymmetry. So the bank from the person who filed the complaint, is sure that the person is a victim, and the bank who received the fraudulent amount of money is sure that its client it has not committed fraud. So again, we have all this again governance issues and the lack of rules and communications and different interests at play, definitely kind of negatively impacting people when it comes to turnaround time. But yeah, I think that's definitely something in the works for Med 2.0, which is less than 30 days for sure, because people need that money.
Wow, 30 days for sure doesn't sound like the kind of speed that you were talking about, Sachin, and enabling through DPI. The one thing I would say,
India is 90 days in PCI. 90.
So it's hardly leapfrogging yet.
90 days, yeah.
Not yet leapfrogging on the TAT. One of the things, Shogat, I would say is that looking at the space right now, there is a real absence of standardized data to benchmark and compare. So I take turnaround times, right? I think the ability to look not just at what the norms are, like we're talking about less than 30 days, less than 90 days, but what is the effective turnaround time? There would be enormous value, I think, in the better production of data across countries and across systems that could encourage a focus on some of these aspects which are key to the consumer experience, like the turnaround time. There's another aspect which is key, where there's been good work done in India as well, which is the user experience about filing a grievance. So there's a requirement in India that access to the grievance mechanism is built into the UPI app. But it turns out that it makes a big difference as to how you place that button and what it looks like and where it sits in the consumer flow as to whether that is used or accessible or understood. So there's a whole wealth of experience that's emerging around the practicalities of making these systems user-friendly and used and trusted, which I think is barely understood, but where there would be the benefit of a lot more exchange around them today. So we're heading into the last, we have about just under 10 minutes left of our time. Sachin, looks like you wanted to build on something there. Please do.
No, not particularly. I wanted to just throw a thought into the mix there, which is that very often what's happening is that even as ODR is becoming acceptable, the reason why the startups, the providers are succeeding in doing things is because they are willing to re-engineer every step of the way, right? Like the filing process. So they are innovating and they have the incentive to do that. But very often their clients, the banks or other providers, have very well established ways of functioning, right? So one of the things that is happening is one pushing the other, saying, why can't you do it like this? Why can't you check this? Why can't you change this relationship? So I want to say that let's not view things in isolation. Let's see how different pieces can push each other into re-engineering processes, because unless you re-engineer processes and change culture, you're not going to get the really big systemic changes. You can't just dump this on the providers, on the ODR providers. So I just want to put that point across, that we need to create these tensions in the system so that the culture change can happen.
Well, that's a great point. And it perhaps also plays back to, it's a good thing to have tensions, but if we don't have a way of resolving them, the leadership that can resolve them, you can be stuck. And maybe that's thinking of the PICS forum, Maria, part of your call there, it sounded like, could you describe it as injecting a bit more tension into thinking around some of the aspects of the consumer experience? But if so, that's where the role of, in this case, the Central Bank of Brazil as the operator, owner, governor of that system is pretty crucial in resolving those tensions. Any insights about how better to resolve tensions, or to create them and then resolve them?
Well, okay, how to fix PICS in 5 minutes. Thank you, David. I did think the interesting thing about PICS is to see how, especially when talking about unintended uses of PICS throughout time, and how the issues that came out of it relates specifically to the fact that they were affected people affected communities within the conversation. I think when we look at the history of PICs, that's very clear. So I think, at this point, if that's not an evidence that, the central bank should be more engaging within those conversations as cases of fraud and schemes rise in Brazil. I don't know what else we can present in terms of evidence. I mean, people have been using Pix as a messaging app, which created, cases from harmful speech and gender-based violence. People have been using more recently. Burger King used to do direct marketing. So because the Pix key, one of the Pix keys that we can use is personal data, and then they had personal data from people who had within the who were registered in their programs, so they were able to forward message it through Pix without any consent, without any acknowledgement from people. So again, those kind of conversations need to happen throughout time, because the central bank has this really tough job of trying to figure out things as they come along, but I don't think they can do it by themselves if they want to do it right. So yeah, I'll say that.
Well, it sounds like that's a dominant theme across both India and Brazil's experience, and frankly, everywhere else as well, which is the central bank really can't do it alone anymore. It really does take an ecosystem, because there are all these unintended usages which are going to happen around societal scale digital systems. And so the only way to address it has to be thinking about ecosystem formation. So as we come just to the last few minutes here, let me ask each of you, what are your parting thoughts with the audience? I don't see any more questions for now from them. So Sachin, can we go to you first as we think about what it takes for this to stick and to work well? You've shared some great insights from your experience. What would you leave the audience with?
I think that, what I would suggest is, if you think that online dispute resolution can be a game changer for a particular type of dispute, a particular type of, category of grievances, then think in terms of what is the basic infrastructure and the infrastructure doesn't just have to be technical. It could also be whatever is the regulatory support, whatever you need to create, and then really think, how do you unlock creativity and innovation on top of that? And I think that the very good example of that is SEBI, what SEBI has done. It needed to create the base, regulate the kind of permission to do certain things, a certain framework. Let's call it. Actually, it put out a specific framework paper. We can even look at that. And then on top of it, recognize very clearly that the only way in which that framework, the ODR would work, is if that creativity was constantly happening and the innovation was constantly happening, and that could not happen from the corporate players, the established exchanges, that would require entrepreneurs to say, hey, we can keep innovating how particular disputes are resolved. So that combination of the framework, which is very sensible policy-led work, and figuring out the right framework, the right permissions, the right, and maybe even technical infrastructure, and then the approach to unlocking the entrepreneurship of the dispute resolution entrepreneurs, right? So I think that way of looking at things is a great example. And there are many examples of India's smart ODR is one, but even in DPI with commerce, that's what they're trying to do, build the basic technical support system and then tell any dispute resolution company, you can provide as long as you integrate into this basic technical system. So if you see that combination, it allows for control, at the same time recognizing that there's no way that the banks are going to be able to innovate fast enough in terms of the challenges that are going to arise, and you need people who got their eye firmly on the ball.
Thanks, Sachin. And so, Maria, you solved Pix's problems in 5 minutes just now, but more generally, what is the message you'd leave today in a minute or so as we finish?
I would say the idea of ecosystem. I think it's very important to bring so many people who are affected by this conversation. I think in Brazil, we're talking about ODR. We need to talk more with judges and legal communities, and then again people who need to activate those resources and recourses. So I'll say that. And also I think language plays an important role here. Again, we're talking about PIX Forum and how the security working group, it's restricted. There's this idea of technical language alienating people. And I think, again, when bringing more people to conversations, you're not going to talk to a judge and explain DPI in a technical matter, but we need those judges to make things work. So I think, having those important conversations and inclusive language, and yeah, I'll say that.
Maria, thank you. And so let me thank Sachin and Maria. You've heard wonderful stories emerging from very quick changing and scaling ecosystems on ODR. But I hope you've heard today that it's not enough to have the system, build the ecosystem, and some various thoughts on the table for today for how to do that. So thank you for joining us. I hope this is useful as you as supervisors go back and think about what it looks like to have scalable ODR systems and ecosystems around them in your countries. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.